Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Another week, another crisis for the BBC. Last week it was Glastonbury and Gaza. This week it is Greg Wallace and possibly Gaza again, if the corporation's report on an earlier Gaza documentary is published. It is said to be imminent. Greg Wallace did not wait for the publication of an inquiry into his behaviour on MasterChef, conducted by lawyers working for the independent company Banjay, which produced the very popular series. He got his retaliation in first, saying he has been cleared of all the most serious charges. We shall see. Meanwhile, the BBC has sacked him from the series, and BBC News reported on Tuesday that since it first published allegations against Mr. Wallace, a further 50 people have come forward with complaints about his behaviour. Is this a matter, primarily, of free speech and banter, a generational divide over what is acceptable? Who is primarily responsible for supervising Greg Wallace's behaviour, the BBC or Banjay? And more importantly, what does this reveal about the power, or rather powerlessness, of young freelancers in the film and TV industry? Marcus Ryder is CEO of the Film and TV Charity and a former head of current affairs at BBC Scotland for over a decade. He recently said that there is a mental health crisis in the industry. Marcus joins me now. So, Marcus Ryder, that first question about whether this is a generational divide, it's just about banter. How do you react to that?
I think it's a slight distraction, because what we're talking about is whether people feel comfortable at work or not. And what certain people from certain communities or demographics feel comfortable and makes them feel comfortable at work will be different from other demographics and other generations. That's just the way the world turns. What's really important is whether, if you feel uncomfortable, whether you have the power and the agency to actually, and the confidence in the organisation that you're in, to talk about how you're feeling, to talk about whether you feel it's an inclusive culture, to talk about whether you feel welcome or not. And for the organisation to be confident enough to stand by its values, if it believes it's banter or not, and to be able to talk about them and defend its values robustly. So what we're having is too many people feeling uncomfortable at work, but more importantly, not feeling that they can talk about it. The very fact that so many people have come forward means that there's a large number of people who up until recently were experiencing something that they felt they couldn't properly talk about. And we need to make sure that we create a culture where people can talk about whether they're feeling comfortable or uncomfortable. It's then for the robustness of the organisation to then decide where the line is.
You see, Greg Wallace says, and he obviously does not seem to believe that he's done anything wrong. I mean, he said he made odd mistakes, but generally he does not think he's wrong. He thinks he was employed as a cheeky, chappy greengrocer, and clearly the BBC saw in him a real talent who they thought who could connect with an audience that perhaps, is not middle class necessarily and perhaps is a bit remote and so on. And he is saying effectively, I think, you are punishing me for being who I am just because the attitudes of society or certain sections of society are changing. Now, do you think there's any validity in that view?
I think what we need is that we need organisations, whether that's Banjay, whether it's the BBC, to be able to stand by their values and be able to articulate their values.
You see, they're all going to be very good about articulating their values, and they'll all have policies that they will produce and say, here it is. But it's one thing to have a policy. It's another thing to actually ensure it's effectively put into action. And you are then dependent, if you do that, on the executive producers, essentially, ensuring that those policies are carried out.
Well, what we have is that the Film and TV Charity looks at, and so this needs to go wider. We need to go wider than Greg Wallace. And the Film and TV Charity produces the Looking Glass survey every 2 years. And what we found in the last Looking Glass survey is that 41% of people working in film and television said that they're experiencing bullying, harassment or discrimination.
41%?
41%. Now, what's really sad is that that's actually gone down. The 2 years previously, it was 44%, right? But what is really relevant is that less than half people felt that they could report it. And what is even worse is that of the people who did report it, only 16% said they thought the situation improved after they reported it.
That's less than half.
And 21% said that after reporting it, situation got worse. And so what we need to do is that, as I said, this is not necessarily, because I don't know the ins and outs of Greg Wallace. What I do know is that we have far too many people working in film and television, feeling, rightly or wrongly, but they're definitely feeling that it's not an environment which is healthy for them. They are feeling that they are being bullied, and they don't feel, less than half feel that it will be addressed. And even the ones who do address it or raise it feel that the situation has got worse. This is not a good culture for us to be working in.
Well, if you look at the background, of course, we're in a situation where most people working for, well, most new people working for the BBC or independent companies are on short-term contracts at a time when, there are various figures, but some have said over 50% of freelancers at any one time are unemployed in the industry. So it's very hard to get a job. It's difficult to retain a job. And if you're on a short-term contract, probably the last thing you want to do is have a row. So the temptation will be to soak it up, won't it? And then perhaps not work for the company or work with that presenter again, but just get on with life because your career is threatened, or you think it is, if you speak up.
Absolutely. And that's what we're finding at the Film and TV Charity. We're finding that due to the freelance atomization of the actual work and how people are working now, and the majority of people working in film production now being freelance, we need, as an industry, to build up even more robust ways in which people can complain, people can speak up, because the financial precarity is real. People are nervous about where they're going to get their next job, whether they're going to be blacklisted. Now, we can argue as to whether those fears are real, or we can argue whether the rate of unemployment that Beck 2 talks about is slightly different from the rate of unemployment that other people. But the fear is real, and the fear creates that culture.
You know, when you're looking at possible solutions to this, you go and you talk to people anecdotally, and I have, and they obviously don't want to be quoted. But what you get is a suggestion that there's been a massive transference of power, essentially to the star. The independent company is desperate for the work. The freelancers are desperate for the work. If the commissioning editor wants a particular star, then the tendency is to give that star what they want and not offend them. And I've heard many stories of people who, I don't know whether you call the behaviour of the star, particular star offensive, but, I can't be able to come in today because I'm too busy. You have people who've been working through the night to get something ready, and then they go to their executive producer and they shrug their shoulders. And the power balance is switched. And the other, if you like, countervailing pressures or powers that used to exist, one of them was, for example, the trade unions. 1,000 years ago when I was younger, and people were on the whole, on staff and so on. If you had a real issue, the trade union would stand up and, help you, and very effectively, actually, in BBC and Lime Grove in my time. Now the trade unions are largely absent. Most of the workforce doesn't belong to a trade union. So that element, Beck 2 makes various reports and so on, but it's not a significant. If you're a freelance and you're not a member of a union, you're additionally vulnerable, aren't you?
Absolutely. I'm finding it hard to even come in, Roger, because all I'm doing is saying yes, and yes again. But I think you're absolutely right with regards to there is a problem with regards to the trade unions. I often talk to freelancers, and whether they feel represented by Beck 2 or the NUJ or Writers Guild, I think is a real problem. Now, I know, because I also speak to Beck 2, and Philippa at Beck 2, that Beck 2 is making real efforts to make sure, and all the unions are making real efforts to make sure that they do represent people. But your prognosis, or your analysis of the situation of unions definitely not having the power, or lots of freelancers not being unionized, and so not feeling that they can speak up, is real. And when you get that culture, or when you get that situation, it creates a culture where people think, I've only got 3 months to bear this. I've only got 2 months to bear this. And people are not acting irrationally.
But you go further than that, don't you? This isn't just a question of people being worried. In a survey that you've done, you say that 1 in 3 people working in the British film and television industry rate their mental health as poor or very poor. And you say that 30% have experienced suicidal thoughts. Quite a lot of it depends, I suppose, how you define suicidal thoughts. Lots of people have them briefly, but let's stick on this figure of 1 in 3 people thinking their mental health is poor, very poor. Is this? The business has always been very stressful. There have been up and downs. I've been in despair about programs and things like that. How do you distinguish between the volatility of the business, which is also almost built in, with the statement that somebody's mental health is poor?
Well, when you ask the general population, and we in the film and TV charity uses exactly the same questions that the general population are asked, and you find that when the general population is asked the same question, the general working population is asked the same question, you will find that the stat is, I think, 6%. Say that in the last 12 months, their mental health has been poor or very poor.
So you're saying that's 6% of the general population and 33%.
Yep.
In our industry.
Of our industry. Similarly, if you ask the same question about suicidal ideation, you find that in the general working population, the statistic is closer to, I think it's 7% off the top of my head. It's 7 or 6%. Whereas in film and television, it is 30%. So something has gone seriously and is going seriously wrong, which is why it is not. Sometimes I worry about saying that it's a mental health crisis, because invariably a crisis is often perceived as a short-term phenomenon. But the reality is that it is a long-term. It's been going on for years. And you, Roger, and I know, having worked at the BBC when I was back in 1992 is when I started. This isn't an indictment of the BBC. This is about the television industry in general, and especially news, broadcast news. That it was a running joke that people were functional alcoholics, that it was kind of a badge of honor that you didn't go and see your family, that you're on your second or third marriage. We I personally normalized what I now look at as being seriously bad working conditions. And I just thought that was just the way life was.
Well, it certainly was the case at ITN. Lots of people will testify that after News at 10, Alistair Burnett, who'd probably been, I'm afraid, on the whiskey all day, would be joined by many of his colleagues. And Alistair Stewart has just spoken about this. And, of course, BBC newsrooms used to have the club next door. Alcohol has largely disappeared, I think. From most areas, but the stress and the strain hasn't. And I think it's increased even at the BBC, because with the need to, at least 30%, some would say more, that in the value of the licence fee, losing that over the last 10 years, what the BBC has been doing is shedding staff and re-employing some in short-term contracts. So if you try and get on to be a member of staff, that's very difficult. And what they do in some cases, if they're faced with people having worked for them for a long time and therefore they might be entitled to be a member of staff, they terminate their contracts. So, who do you blame? The BBC for that, the fact that government hasn't put up the licence fee, whatever. But it's happening not just, as it were, outside of the BBC, it's happening within the BBC. The additional problem, of course, is when we talk about responsibility. And you'll know this from your job in the BBC. It is more difficult, isn't it, if you're in the BBC, to, as it were, keep an eye on exactly what is going on with the production if it's being done outside by an independent. When you were a head of current affairs and stuff, you could walk through buildings, you'd have a look, you get a feeling, you maybe have a drink with somebody, you'd get a sense of what if things were brewing and so on. But if you're dealing with an independent producer who's in offices well away from you, you are absolutely dependent on that producer telling you what's going wrong, because it's unlikely that you will spot it very early if you are the publisher as the BBC is.
That's true. But what I would guard against is that when we published our last Looking Glass, when the charity published its last Looking Glass survey, I was worried that this would just be a tsunami of incredibly negative stats, and people would run for the hills thinking that, the world and screen production is just going to head in a handcart. However, what we asked for the first time in this survey compared to the other survey, other surveys previously is whether people had used the charity services and more of what we term as the upstream services, in particular the whole picture toolkit, which is how do you set up your production in as mentally healthy way as possible. Now, this won't address some of the macro problems that you're talking about with regards to whether the very nature of freelance creates financial precarity. It won't address the contraction of the industry, but it addresses some of the working practices on productions. And so you can set up your production in a mentally healthy way. And if you look at those stats, people who had worked on productions which had used the whole picture toolkit, people who had reported having a serious mental health condition went from 33% to 24%. People who reported the industry being a mentally healthy place to work went from 12% increased to 25%. Now, that's not amazing, only 25% thinking that it's a mentally healthy place to work. It's nothing that we should pop the champagne for, but it's dramatically different from 12%. We shouldn't be popping the champagne that 25%, a quarter of people still said that they experienced a serious mental health experience in the last 12 months. We're not popping the champagne about that, but we can see real progress because that's 25% compared to 33%. And so I think while I agree with you that there are some serious systemic issues about how much finances there are, that doesn't absolve the broadcasters, that doesn't absolve individual executives from trying to find ways to set up their productions in as mentally healthy way as possible. The charity is there to help that. There are other organizations as well that can try and help with that. And we need to seek that out. We need, as individuals and as departments, how do we ensure that they are as mentally healthy as possible? How do we have procedures so that people feel confident if they feel bullied to complain and that their problems will be addressed? I think we can do some real positive work. We shouldn't just throw our hands up and say, oh, life is terrible. It's always been this way.
There's another problem, I think, which is prevalent, and it's understandable as budgets get squeezed, revenues go down and so on, is that commissioners want the same programme, but for less money. Now, I know of a number of cases where people have come out of a production almost, flat out and exhausted. 12-hour days are a normal. 16-hour days in some instances are normal. This is getting insane. And yet the commissioning editors say we want the same programme, but we've got slightly less money. But do it again. It requires a very brave, shall we say, independent producer to say, I can't do it, and I'm not going to do it, because the pressures on the staff I employ will be too great. And the danger is that the commissioners say, well, if you don't want to do it, it's up to you, we'll find someone else. Unless the industry acts collectively and again starts to protect people in terms of working hours that they do, set aside the bullying, just the fact that some people are now working their way to a physical breakdown, some young people, by what's being required of them. The industry can do surely something about that. It must be possible to say to commissioning editors, you cannot have, on the whole, the same programme for significantly less money. You have to adjust. You must ensure that young people do not work so many hours that they have physical, let alone mental breakdowns. You've got to start to enforce some of these conditions, and it's not being enforced. All of us know about young people working insane hours, being sent home by taxi and being brought in 5 hours later. We could have stopped that, haven't we? But we're all being dishonest in the industry if we don't acknowledge that. And if commissioners don't acknowledge, that is what they are, that by commissioning, the sort of budget, with the budgets they are, that's what they're responsible for.
It is a real problem. And I think that it's also a cultural problem because there are far too many senior execs and far too many commissioners who say, well, that's what I did in my day. And I earned my stripes by working 12-hour, 13-hour days. I remember being, I think it was 28, 29, and part of my beard dropping out because of stress. And I thought that was normal. I thought that's just happened. You're working really hard. Production is stressful. It's just normal for part of your beard to fall out. And so the first thing we have to do is that we have to stop the normalization of thinking that 13-hour days is good for anybody. We need to stop the normalization of thinking that this is part of the process of earning your stripes. The only thing I would add to the point that you made, Roger, is that we're not just talking about young people. What the film and TV charity is seeing is that we're seeing the MDs of small and medium-sized production companies in tremendous mental distress because they're carrying the weight of the careers and the livelihood of dozens, occasionally for short periods of time, even hundreds of people, and they're carrying that against tremendous pressure. And so they need support. Not only that, I think it's also wrong for us not to recognise that the commissioners are also under insane strain and pressure as well. There is no easy baddie. We are just looking left, right, up and down and seeing victims of poor mental health all along the production chain, from the commissioners to the MDs of companies, to the execs, to the series producers, all the way down to the runners. So the industry needs to change. And the film and TV charity is working with the commissioning bodies. They're working with the Banner Js of this world, with the All3 Medias, with the smaller companies as well, because everything, all the way through the production chain, we need to find better working practices because everybody is suffering.
So you don't think you are dealing with employers who are essentially in denial? They may not be sufficiently active, but you think that they, and the BBC for that matter, or Channel 4 elsewhere, really understand the scale of this issue and are prepared to act upon it?
I think that they understand the scale of the issue, absolutely. I think everybody needs help in identifying how do we act to solve this problem. As you said, Roger, do we blame the government for the license fee? Do we blame Google for the ad revenue, which ITV and Channel 4 no longer have? I think we need to get past looking at the blame, and we need to look at how do we support the people all the way through who are working in really difficult conditions without judgment.
Marcus Ryder, CEO of the Film and TV Charity, thank you very much. And just before you go, if people want to read your report, the latest one which talks about mental health, how do they access it?
The easiest way is to go via our website. Just Google Film and TV Charity Looking Glass Report.
Marcus Ryder, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Marcus Ryder, CEO of the Film and TV Charity. And if you're enjoying our journalism, please do support us for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. That's it for this week, and as you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.